everybody, and welcome to another All About Alopecia video. Today we are going to have a little bit of a chat about research into alopecia. So firstly, I will introduce myself, and I'm Jen, and I'm the Charity Development Manager for Alopecia UK. And we also have...
I'm Carolyn, and I'm the Research Manager for Alopecia UK.
Yeah. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat between us. We've also, Carolyn's had a bit of a chat with the chair of our research committee. And we did try to get a couple of other researchers to film some stuff for us, but they've just been too busy, and we have kind of pulled this together quite quickly, all of these videos. So these are definitely videos that we can expand on in the future though, so let us know what you're interested in hearing about. But firstly, I thought it was worth having a little chat, Carolyn, about like, who are you and what do you do at Alopecia UK? What's your role at Alopecia UK?
So as the research manager, I kind of have quite a broad role. So I do a lot of things about communicating about the research that we do. So I have a lay panel that I talk to, and I also do some regular kind of research updates with people as well. I try and get researchers to do research blogs for us that we pop up on the webpage. And then I also organise things like asking for participants for research projects. And then sort of the other side of that is working on funding research. So a little bit of that is about setting up a research strategy and working out what kinds of research we want to fund and what conditions we want to support research into. And then the other side of that is also just running funding calls. So advertising that we have some money to spend on research and asking some of the big clinical and medical researchers in the alopecia field to apply to us for money to do some specific projects.
Yeah. So that sounds really interesting. So I think one of the key things that we wanted to get was to start bridging this gap between... There was a lot of, I think, at the charity, and I've very much noticed over the years that there's a lot of people out there with alopecia, myself included, who are always kind of, you know, there's nothing happening, there's no research happening. And for me, I was just very unaware really of the things that were happening. So I think that's why it's been an important part of your job role to bridge that gap between what's happening in the research world and the alopecia community, because I think it's nice for people with alopecia to know that things are happening and to understand the kind of things that are getting looked into and things. So I think that's one of the big things of what you've been doing in your job. And then obviously as the charity has grown and we've expanded and our income has started to grow, it means we've been able to spare a bit of money to be able to start putting into research, which has been really nice and a sign of the charity developing and growing. So that's why it's been important to have yourself, Carolyn, in place to be able to kind of manage all that and make sure that it's all happening as it needs to happen. So it's been great to... Carolyn's only been in post for the last 12 months. So it's been an exciting development, I think, for Alopecia UK to have a research manager in place and developing it all. So it's been fab. So tell us, you mentioned the lay panel earlier, Carolyn. Can you tell us a little bit about the lay panel and what they do?
Yeah, the lay panel are amazing. So it's a group of people with different types of alopecia. And what they do is they actually do a whole wide range of work with researchers, and they help us to kind of work out what our strategy is. So a good example is recently we had a researcher who wanted to apply for a really big pot of funding. And he wanted some people with alopecia to look through some of the questions he was thinking about answering in the project, just to say whether they felt relevant to them. So lots of people in the lay panel did that. And then we have kind of more specialized bits. So recently we had a lady who wanted to set up a specific set of interviews with men with alopecia, and she wanted a man with alopecia to look through the questions first, just to work out if they were appropriate or felt invasive or anything like that. So those are kind of two of the sort of day-to-day examples. And then once a year we have our grant funding round, and the lay panel also read through all the funding applications and score them for us as well, to tell them how relevant they feel they are to people with alopecia. And that's why it's really important to have a group of people with different types of hair loss as well, just so that we get representation of different conditions too.
Yeah, and so I think basically in the technical term of a lot of what's happening there is it PPI, patient
Patient and public involvement, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. So we're helping a lot of researchers to do that, and so the more we can bring that patient voice into research, the better, really, isn't it? So.
It is, it's fantastic, and things that you already had in place, like having the patient vote, is really nice, because then you actually, by getting people with alopecia to vote on what research projects you want to fund, you're kind of bringing in a much wider audience of people who maybe wouldn't have the time to actually do that full kind of PPI role.
Brilliant. And so we now also have, we've had for a couple of years now, a research committee, which has been another big process or structure to get in place for the charity. So can you tell me a little bit about the research committee and the type of people on that and what they do?
Yeah, so we're actually really lucky, because alopecia is quite a wide, it's not just a wide range of conditions, because you don't just have alopecia areata, you've got the scarring alopecias and androgenetic alopecia. So because you've got that wide range of conditions, you actually need quite a wide group of people on your research committee. So we have basic scientists who do, you know, really do lab-based research, like Simon Milling, like Fiona Henriquez. And then we have clinicians like Matt Harry and Abby Macbeth. So they're both dermatologists, and they have more of a kind of, you know, clinical point of view, but that's quite helpful, because then we also have psychologists. So we've got Diana Harcourt and Nigel Hunt on there at the moment, and they're both psychologists who look into things that affect people's appearance. And in order to kind of bridge the gap between psychology and basic science research, having clinicians who are interested in both the basic science, which might eventually lead to some kind of treatment, and then psychology, which might lead to treatment on the other side, you've got a really kind of broad range of people. And we do, you know, we have Andrew Messenger, Dev Tobin, we have a whole wide range. And then obviously our wonderful pharma representative as well. We have Annika Strand, who's fantastic. And then we have a couple of trustees. So we've got Harry and Karen, and they help to represent the voice of people who have alopecia on that research committee. So it really does, it varies from having pharma, clinicians, all the way up to people with alopecia. And that kind of the role of the committee is both to work with the lay panel and with people with alopecia to work out what research we should fund and what we should be aiming to do research-wise in the future, but also to do things like working out, reading through the grants and commenting on and deciding which projects we're actually going to fund year to year.
Yeah. All I was going to say earlier was the other patient rep as well on that committee is Annika. Like, Annika's on there as somebody with alopecia, but she also happens to work in pharma as well, doesn't she? So that's quite a nice.
Yeah, I think it's nice because she's got that science background, and she has got, you know, she's done quite a bit of research into alopecia as well. So yeah, she has that sort of dual-edged role. And then Nigel's got alopecia as well.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So there's a lot of people where we're doubling up on what they do.
Well, that's the great thing, isn't it? Because you've got both points of view. You don't just have someone going, I'm a scientist and I want to, you know, grow some new hair follicles in a dish. You've got people going, I'm a scientist and I want to do this, and someone else going, I have alopecia, I want you to do something for me.
Yeah, definitely. So we now have, we've got a chair of our research committee, who is Simon Milling. And Carolyn is now going to introduce Simon, and we're going to play a little chat that Carolyn and Simon had about some of the research that's happening up in Glasgow that Simon's also involved with. So we will play that now.
So yeah, Simon, he's fantastic. He's the chair of our research committee. He's a professor of immunity and infection, so he's an immunologist based at the University of Glasgow. And he's done quite a lot of work in autoimmune conditions. And one of the conditions that he works on with his PhD student at the moment is alopecia areata. And they were also kind of instrumental in helping to set up the Alopecia Biobank that we have up at Glasgow. And they've collected samples now from, I think it's more than 97 people. So they're doing a really great job in collecting samples from people with alopecia areata that other researchers can also use to kind of expand the possibilities for research into alopecia.
So we'll play that recording now between Simon and Carolyn.
It'd be great if you could just start by telling me a little bit about what you know about the cells that are involved in alopecia areata and what they do, how they attack the hair follicles.
Hi, it's great to be here. It's lovely to talk to you today. I'm excited about the work that we're doing in Glasgow and also the work that we've been doing with Alopecia UK for the last few years. As you say, I'm an immunologist. So as an immunologist, I'm interested in looking at the cells of the immune system and trying to understand how they contribute to alopecia. We've known for many years that a particular type of immune cell called a T cell is the cell that can attack hair follicles and cause hair to fall out. So the work that I'm doing in Glasgow is looking at the T cell response to alopecia and trying to understand what controls that response. We've known for many years that T cells can attack hair follicles and cause the hair to fall out. What we don't know so much about is what sustains that. Why is it that once a hair has fallen out, it doesn't come back again? So the work we've been doing recently in Glasgow is to look at the other cells involved in the immune response to understand what maintains hair loss. We're very interested in Glasgow in the macrophage. So a macrophage is a cell that can talk to T cells, and we think it plays a key role in contributing to the maintenance of hair loss. Macrophages and T cells talk together, and the T cells which kill the follicles continue to do that because the macrophages tell them to. So at the moment, we're very interested in how macrophages and T cells communicate to maintain hair loss in patches of alopecia where the hair just doesn't grow back again. Okay.
So do we actually know anything about what the macrophages and T cells are actually looking for in the hair follicle?
Yes, we do a little bit. We know that sometimes when hair grows back again in people with alopecia, it grows back without any pigment. So sometimes white hairs come back. And that suggests very clearly that the things that the immune system is targeting are molecules associated with generating color in hair. So there are molecules called melanin, for instance, which are generated in the body, which give color to skin and to hair. The targets for the immune system seem to be associated with the process that generates melanin. So that's why the hair becomes a target for the immune system and why it is that it's hair that's specifically targeted. We think in people with alopecia, there's a specific immune response that kills hairs, but this response is underlined by a response throughout the body. So we find it from our research in Glasgow, and other people have also shown that people with alopecia don't just have an attack on their hair follicles, they also have changes in their immune system throughout their body, which show that they're more likely to make immune responses when they shouldn't. And this underlying inflammation, if you like, is what is able to drive the hair loss in people with alopecia.
Fairly recently, you and your wonderful PhD student, Kim Bain, published a paper which looked at this association of depression symptoms and the type of inflammation that we find in alopecia areata. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, so we are interested in the immune response in the whole body as well as what's happening in the skin in people with alopecia. And the easiest way to look at that is to look at the immune molecules that are circulating in people's blood. So with the help of Alopecia UK, we've got together some patients who were happy to give us blood samples. And we looked in those blood samples to understand the immune molecules, we call them cytokines, that are involved in contributing to alopecia. So we find that people with alopecia have higher levels of circulating cytokines than people who don't have alopecia. That's important because the specific cytokines help us understand how the condition works and the elements of the immune system that drive alopecia. What we know from other conditions is that people who have circulating cytokines, those cytokines can themselves contribute to things other than the immune response. So cytokines can affect the way your brain works. If you think about people who have a fever, they behave differently. They have a kind of sickness behavior where when you have a fever, which is driven by the immune response, then you can behave differently. So we think in a different way, people with alopecia, just like people who have other long-term inflammatory conditions, that the cytokines that are produced by the immune system might contribute to the way that you feel when you have alopecia. So the work that we did demonstrated that there may be a connection between one or two of the specific cytokines that are circulating in the blood of people with alopecia that might in some way contribute to the depression that we know is experienced by lots of people who have the condition. So there are lots of, depression is multifactorial. There are lots of things that can drive depression in people with alopecia. But we think that one of those elements is also likely to be the cytokines that are circulating in the blood of alopecia patients.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Simon. So one of the other things that you've done that's been really amazing is actually set up a biobank for tissues and obviously clinical data from people with alopecia areata in Glasgow. And can you tell me a little bit more about that and what you're using those samples for?
Yes, the Biobank has been fantastic. The Biobank was really an initiative of Alopecia UK. So representatives of Alopecia UK approached me a few years ago now to ask if more could be done to look at, to do research into alopecia. And what came out of those discussions is that we needed better access to samples from people with alopecia so that we could understand the disease better. And because of that, we set up with the help of Alopecia UK, we set up a biobank in Glasgow where volunteers, often they're identified by the charity, they're volunteers who come to the charity, come to us through the charity. The volunteers will come along to the clinic and they will give us samples that we can use to try and understand the condition better. So those samples, depending on what the person is prepared to donate for us, those samples will often be blood. We're asking for stool samples so we can understand the relationship between our bacteria and alopecia. And if people are prepared to give them, we're also interested in skin samples so we can look at the cells that are involved in alopecia in the skin itself. So we take a full clinical history. It's all properly anonymized so that the researchers can never identify the individuals who've given the samples. And we use those samples to further the research that we're doing in Glasgow. We now have more than 50 people who have donated to the biobank, and the numbers increasing every week. So it's a fantastic resource for investigating the science behind alopecia.
Oh, that's brilliant. So you mentioned the word bacteria there, which is really interesting. So can you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing with looking at the role of bacteria and alopecia?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. There's been an explosion in our understanding of how the bacteria that live in our intestines can contribute to the immune response throughout our whole body. So that's not just in alopecia, but that's in all sorts of conditions. So there are lots of associations now identified where people who have different, particularly immune-mediated conditions, have different bacteria that live in their intestines. The immune system and the bacteria have a complicated interrelationship with each other where both can affect each other. So one of the questions that Alopecia UK, the representatives of Alopecia UK came to us with originally is the question of whether we could find out whether our intestinal bacteria contribute to alopecia in people who have that condition. So that's why we're collecting stool samples from volunteers. Those samples have all now been sent off to the lab where we can count all the individual bacteria that the alopecia patients and also some healthy controls have to compare the two together and try to understand if there are differences between the intestinal bacteria in people with alopecia compared to people who don't have alopecia. So we're very excited to see what those results bring us, and we hope we'll get those results in the coming months.
Fantastic. That's brilliant, Simon. So I guess kind of final question for you would be, where do you think alopecia research is heading? What do you think is the kind of future angles that we'll be looking at? Oh,
that's a tough question. The most important thing is to find treatments that work. So at the moment, I'm told that it's a little bit frustrating in that there aren't treatments available that are really effective. That might be starting to change. But my angle really, and I think the angle for anybody who's working in the field, is to try to understand how the disease works better so that we can find new treatments. That really has to be the focus. I think that's what people with alopecia would hope that scientists who are working on the condition are actually trying to find out. What those new treatments will be, I don't know yet, but I think they're likely to involve targets that influence how the immune system works so that we can manipulate it in ways that stop hair loss without stopping the rest of our immune systems working properly. And that's the delicate balance we have to try to make to stop the immune processes that make that cause hair loss without stopping the immune processes that we need for our survival to protect us from our environment. So there's a balance there that immunologists and others are trying to find, which I hope will help us to find new treatments for the future.
Okay, so we're back, Carolyn. We've just played that great little interview between Carolyn and Simon, which I think is really interesting insight into the research that they're kind of doing up in Glasgow. So I had a few questions for you, Carolyn. I'm going to quiz you because I know you've got a lot of knowledge in your head. We don't need all these researchers. I'll just ask you. Carolyn is actually, before this, a researcher, weren't you, Carolyn? So
yeah, but diabetes too.
Yeah, but she's got a good understanding, and she's picked up the alopecia very, very quickly with the research. So I'm going to quiz you, Carolyn. So Simon mentioned about changes in immune responses throughout the body. I just had a question. Is this why a lot of people with alopecia will have kind of multiple conditions? So, for example, I know a lot of people have thyroid, which I myself have an underactive thyroid, and other things like arthritis or eczema and things. Is this why people get often more than one?
So, well, it's kind of that. If you listen to Angela Cristiano, what she says is actually the genetics behind alopecia areata. Some of the genes behind her for all autoimmune diseases are genes linked to the immune system and the immune response. And quite often you'll find similar changes between one autoimmune condition and another. And that's the trick, one of the tricks with alopecia areata. It's an autoimmune condition. And if you have one autoimmune condition, you are just slightly more likely to develop another one.
Right. And I'm just going to explain who that is. So Angela Cristiano, who Carolyn has just mentioned, is one of the key researchers in alopecia, really, isn't she? From right at the very beginning. She's over in America. She's fantastic, has done a huge amount for research into alopecia. We did try to get her to do a little bit for this, didn't we, Carolyn? But I think she's really yeah. But no, so if you can ever kind of look up some of the stuff that Angela Cristiano's done, and I think we'll touch on that again because I've got some more questions. She's a big researcher in the alopecia world. So that's who she is. I thought so. He's also, I guess, Simon was talking about immune responses, and there's some interesting comments about kind of depression. And I think that we've seen recently, or since you've been in this post, is when I've become aware of this statistic. About 60% of people with alopecia areata might go on to develop depression or anxiety. But I seem to remember talking with Simon, and Simon's touched on that. I seem to remember when talking with him that it was a bit of a chicken or egg thing, because I think there was this, does that come first, or does the alopecia come first? And all these changes that are happening in the body, they're not quite sure what's.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Simon explained it really nicely once to me, where he said, you know, if you're feeling sick, you're supposed to feel bad. Your body is like, you know, and so when you mount an immune response, you make a lot of different chemicals in the body which change the environment in the body, because they're saying, hold on, you're not very well, slow down, you know, don't go out and run a marathon today, slow down. And that's kind of what it's trying to say. And the sort of what they found with alopecia was that there was a signature of molecules that you make, and that those seem to be associated with not feeling great. But yeah, whether you feel depressed and then you get alopecia, or you are depressed, or you're not feeling very well and then you feel depressed or slightly less well than usual, is that kind of question that you can't really answer.
Yeah. So there's lots of interesting things going on there in the body, really, isn't there? And there's a lot still to be answered, I think it would be fair to say, but it's interesting that they're finding all of these things and exploring.
It's great. And if people didn't go and sign up to the Biobank and go and do those appointments and give samples, then all that research wouldn't happen. So, you know, it's an amazing thing that people are doing.
So which brings us on to the Biobank, actually, because and I was gonna mention on that. So I think it's important to mention as well. So Alopecia UK, we obviously merged with Autoimmune Alopecia Research UK in 2017, and the Biobank was a project that they got started, and then as we've merged, it's all come together as one. And I think so. There's one of the big things that we've done there to help that along. There's the Biobank, and then what we've done is we've funded the nurses' time, because what these things often need is to pay for the nurses' time to actually take the samples and do all of that process, isn't it? And that's as a charity, we're still quite small, but that's the type of thing that we can pay for that really helps that type of thing along, and to start building up these biobanks. And am I right in thinking, Carolyn, there is a few biobanks or places collecting alopecia samples across the UK, isn't there now? So there's Glasgow, which we've helped along, and they, you know, use their samples and share those samples with other researchers as well. But there's Bradford and there's...
Yeah, so Bradford are collecting for a specific project.
Right.
But yeah, so there's Bradford as well. I think you'll see more of these happening as we go along as well, because those samples, if you take a sample, it doesn't necessarily all have to be used for one project. You know, you can keep some of it and use it for others as well. So depending on the ethics, but...
Say that again.
Depending on the ethical approval, because some projects say, right, that's the project, use the sample for it, now destroy it. So...
But it sounds like, I mean, this is definitely an area where the charity can help things along with, and I know we were looking at one point at expanding it into another site with the Glasgow Biobank to collect from another site and things like that. And this has been the type of thing that we've just only starting to look into, and things for the kind of the future as to where things can develop and things. So good to know, I think, as to how we can help things like that along.
Absolutely, and it's easy for us to help in more than one way, because we can give some funding for nurses, but we can also do recruitment for participants. So
yeah, well, yeah, and we did for the Glasgow one, didn't we? Trying to help. I think we did for Bradford as well, actually.
We did for Bradford too, yeah.
Amy went along because she's near there, yeah. So
she wrote a really good blog piece about that, actually. So.
Yeah, it did, about getting a biopsy and stuff. So I thought it would be nice as well. They've obviously touched on sort of some of the research that they're doing there and where things might go in future. But I thought we could just have a little chat about kind of other areas of research going on in the world. So I think that one of the biggest areas is there is a potential treatment option in the pipeline with all of this JAK stuff, isn't there? So there's a huge amount going on with the JAK stuff, which is as a result of some of the stuff Angela Cristiano's been doing eventually, and they discovered. So what is it that just, I mean, very briefly, we don't need to go into detail about it, but what is when people hear the word JAK inhibitors and that related to alopecia, what does it mean and what's actually happening?
So a JAK inhibitor is actually kind of really specific type of immunosuppressant. So it stops a little bit of your immune system from working, and because of what it hits, it actually hits a group of specific cells that attack the hair follicles and stop them from working in alopecia areata. And I think there are now 5 different clinical trials registered in the US and sort of worldwide for JAK inhibitors for alopecia areata. It's kind of difficult to get the right numbers out at the moment, because quite a lot of them are looking at different stages of alopecia. So people with more than 50% hair loss or patchy, and one of them is looking at a topical, so cream rather than an oral tablet, which is what most of the JAK inhibitors are. But the studies look really nice. There's somewhere around 40% to 60% reported success rate, but that can vary according to the type of drug, because they're all slightly different. So when you say JAK inhibitors, there are actually 4 different types of JAK, and the JAK inhibitors themselves will inhibit different ones. So they're actually numbered JAK1, 2, 3, and then TYK2, I think it's 2. But actually what happens is the JAK inhibitors will be made up to be like JAK1 that inhibits JAK1 and 2, or one that inhibits JAK1 and 3, or just JAK3, or a pan-JAK inhibitor. And that's the other thing they kind of need to understand, is which mix is the best, or is it best? Because obviously the less immunosuppression you have, the better. So the less JAKs you can target, the better.
Right. So
that's kind of where the work is going on. There are quite a few studies. There was one study running in the UK that obviously is still, I think they've finished recruiting for it, but I think there's a second phase coming up, and that will hopefully start recruiting at some point in the near future.
So, and from my perspective, it's been interesting to see the progression of all of that, because it's only probably in the last 5 years that this has taken off, where it's interesting to see, like, they were doing all the research, and then they kind of came across that like, oh, these JAK inhibitors might work for alopecia, and then to see, and until that point there wasn't probably huge interest in alopecia really, and then because there's this potential thing, and then you see like how things then sort of explode in a way once the pharmaceutical companies become interested, because like you said, there's all those companies that are now interested, and then there's this explosion of like clinical trials and things like that happening, and that was all happening in the US, and it is now coming across to like the UK and Europe now. I know there's clinical trials happening in this country now on JAK inhibitors, so it's been really interesting to see just the progression of how the research world kind of works. So things feel a lot different now to even just sort of 6-7 years ago, I think. And I remember going to the World Congress in 2015 in Miami, and then the World Congress in Barcelona last year. Is that right? I can't remember if I've got my times right, but anyway, because we missed Japan. So the 4 years, because they're every 2 years, and the difference of like how much things had changed in that 4-year period was huge, really. So
it's amazing, and they were really lucky because with JAK inhibitors, the drugs that they first tried out, first tested really small scale, were drugs that were actually already available for another autoimmune condition. So it wasn't like you had to go, oh, this is what we need to attack. We need to start work from scratch and build, create a drug. It was like, okay, actually, this is something that we can see, and we already have a treatment or a therapy that we use for a different condition. Potentially, we could use that for this.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think it's interesting. I remember some of the dermatologists, previously they'd be saying like, oh, there's nothing on the horizon, and nothing treatment-wise has changed for like years. It's just been a lot of the same stuff. And so what's quite interesting now is that I think within 5-10 years, it sounds like likely there will be another treatment option out there for people. Might not be the treatment option everybody wants, but certainly that some people definitely want. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the good thing, because people want different things. And yeah, I mean, the ones under trial at the moment, most of them are being made specifically for alopecia. So although they tested it out originally with drugs for another condition, they've actually kind of reformulated them for alopecia. So it'll be interesting to see what comes through in the end.
Yeah. So, and which again, you've brought us nicely on there, where you've said, people want different things from treatments. And so another big area that's currently kind of getting a lot of attention is the microbiome, isn't it? So Angela Cristiano's now it sounds like she's turned her attention now to the microbiome. Is that fair to say?
She's working on the microbiome. We've got Claire Higgins, who's just about to start a project looking at the scalp microbiome and lots of different types of alopecia, which would be really interesting. But yeah, pretty much every time I do a search, I find a bunch of papers looking at the impact of either the gut microbiome or the skin microbiome. So it's fascinating. And that, I mean, I guess the thing is that we do know that the bacteria, fungus, parasites, everything in our gut talks to our immune system and informs it about what's going on. But it's also a lot of the bacteria in the gut we need to then make nutrients for us that we can't make. So it's this real careful balance of sort of communication and providing stuff for us, and then we provide home.
So I think, and I remember again, I think Barcelona I caught one of Angela's talks, and she mentioned at the moment, the last that I heard, it sounded like what they'd noticed was a difference in the gut signature of somebody with alopecia to the controls, which is, Joe Blogg's average. So there's something going on there, isn't there, with it? It doesn't.
Yeah, certainly her study shows there's a couple of studies that show that it looks like there's a difference, not necessarily in the type, I can't remember exactly, but I think it's more to do with the numbers in particular populations. So you've got lots more of one than you'd normally have.
Yeah. So again, this is still an area that's very much just in the research phase, and once they start to kind of figure more stuff out, that's when it can then move into kind of developing potential treatments, targeted sort of stuff.
Absolutely, and that's what they did with the JAK inhibitors, because they looked at the genetics behind it and they found a particular, a signature. They looked at the immune cells And then they went, oh yeah, okay, we could try JAK inhibitors, that might be sensible. And it's the same kind of, it'll be the same process for microbiome. It'll be like, okay, this is different, what can we do to change that?
Yeah. And what's quite interesting is how some of this came about, isn't it, with was there 1 or 2 studies where somebody with what that condition that really changes something, you've got real gut problems, but they also happen to have alopecia, and they gave them fecal transplant and noticed that which isn't for everyone, but then noticed that the hair was regrowing, which has kind of sparked that interest in sort of like, oh, something's interesting's happening here.
Yeah, there are a couple of case studies where they've done that now with the fecal transplants, and it's really interesting.
I'm not sure that everyone should rush out and get a fecal transplant just yet, though.
I think there will be other ways of changing that, and there'll be other ways that they can modulate the bacteria in the gut. So
yeah, so hopefully a more pleasant way.
I'm not sure it's massively unpleasant, actually, but hey.
Oh, right, okay. I don't know much about it, to be honest. But no, so I think those would it be fair to say those are the kind of the big 2 areas at the moment, aren't there? This that's happening, JAK's microbiome, and then a lot of exploratory stuff probably going on. Like, is the Glasgow one quite exploratory? With a few
yeah, I mean, the Glasgow one's great because it actually covers quite a lot there, because they're looking at the cell types involved in alopecia areata. That's really basic science. So that's saying, okay, which is what led to the JAK inhibitors, essentially. So you're at that stage of going, right, what are these cells doing? Why are they there? What are they looking for? And you'll find things like Des Tobin's group over in Ireland are also doing that kind of exploratory work. And the Bradford study that we've funded is looking at the types of cells, but they'll also be looking at what the cells are showing to the immune system. So
and I think that was something I've noticed. All of this is always a learning curve for me. And I was at another conference in Milan, and they were talking about, I went to like a research one, and he had a slide, and I need to find it from somewhere, but it was very much kind of like, you've got your basic science, which is your exploratory sort of thing, and then that develops on where they can start to look at treatment avenues or something, and then
so it's like basic translational, and then you've got the clinical trials.
See, there you go. So that, and I think that's things like that I think are quite nice for people to know and understand, though, because you realize then how research works, and it does take time to kind of get things through that whole process. And
I mean, the JAK inhibitors actually has been quite quick. Quite often with something, to go from basic research to clinical trial can take 15, 17 years. And, that's something to really kind of think about, is, actually going through that basic work. And that's why JAK inhibitors is lucky, because a lot of the work, the sort of safety studies had already been done. So it wasn't going and saying, we need to formulate a new drug as well. It was saying, okay, we've got this might work.
Well, it's interesting. And then do you know of any other kind of stuff that's going on research-wise?
It depends what kind of, I mean, lots of people are, so there's been a few studies looking at JAK inhibitors for scarring alopecia just recently, which is quite interesting, because it looks like people go in and they've seen an effect in alopecia areata, so now they're moving and looking at the JAK inhibitors for scarring alopecia. There are also, there have been a few studies looking at the topical immunotherapy, so basic DCPC, diphenycycline. She says, I'm not gonna, but there have been a few studies looking at that recently as well. But the majority of the work, is actually looking at microbiome at the moment. So that's, it's popular, and it's popular in other autoimmune conditions as well. So it's definitely something on the cards.
And then we've got to just touch on this big question, because people hear about the microbiome and the gut, and then it's kind of like, right, well, if I kind of fix this, if I change my diet, and we still don't have those kind of firm answers. But I believe there's it's the only one that I know of and have heard of, that there is actually now nutritional trials happening. There's one over in America, I think, that I heard about again at World Congress, and I just thought it was interesting that then, starting to kind of looking at it. I think it's definitely an area that's of interest to a lot of people with alopecia, because everyone kind of, you know, sometimes you want to be able to just try and fix it yourself, and if I can just change what I eat, but there's so many different things which we won't go into now. But yeah, are you aware of any other nutritional stuff, or is that the only one?
That's the only one I'm aware of at the moment, but I would say there's quite a few. I mean, there are a lot of studies that go on in China and Japan that we don't necessarily hear as much about, and there have been studies looking at various different things like vitamin D supplementation and things like that. So there are always new studies coming out about that. It's just varies as to when they do. So there was a batch earlier this year looking at vitamin D, so we'll see.
I imagine more of that might happen as well as more things become clearer with the microbiome stuff, because
and I think as more people, if more people get interested in alopecia research, you'll find more different projects coming out, and I think that's the really important thing to remember, is that's part of our role, part of what we're supposed to be doing, you know, is to get people, researchers out there, to go, oh, actually I work on this autoimmune condition, but I could have a look at alopecia areata as well, or I could have a look at the scarring alopecias. So it is really important that we do that too. And
somehow, Carolyn, I think you've nicely brought me onto what I was going to talk about as a final thing, which is the importance of some of the things we're doing at the charity. So, and it's getting that interest from researchers there, because at the moment the charity and the size that we are, we're quite minimal really in the research terms, aren't we, with grants of 10,000, or, you know, hopefully we can grow that for next year. But we're quite small. But, you know, I remember talking to one of our research committee, and they were saying, you know, even given grants sometimes of 1,000 or 1,500 for like a summer project for a researcher who's like a student researcher, like sometimes that's when you can kind of get their interest in the subject of alopecia. And he told me about some that had received those years back, and they're now two really prominent alopecia researchers. And so that's why I think it's really important that we do continue and to be able to develop on what we can fund. I mean, do you want to say a little bit about the types of project that we fund?
Yeah, I mean, we have actually funded some quite diverse projects now. So we funded some bigger sort of £10,000 ones, which do tend to be either psychology, which is great because we do need that kind of that understanding about impact, and it would be great to have psychological interventions that worked as well. So it tends to be psychology, but otherwise basic research. Most of the bigger projects we've done have been basic research, like the Biobank, but then also we funded a study looking at links between celiac disease and alopecia areata. We funded another one, which was very basic science, looking at types of cells involved in alopecia areata. And then this year we kind of had more of a focus on scarring alopecia. So we funded a project looking at the genetics of frontal fibrosing alopecia in women. And that was another quite big one. But then we also funded a really nice broad one looking at the scalp microbiome in several different types of alopecia, which includes areata and androgenetic alopecia. So that's quite nice and broad. Then we have funded some really small projects. So one looking at microRNAs in scarring alopecia, which was only £1,000, but actually was kind of really nice add-on to an existing project looking at microRNAs in other autoimmune conditions. And then this year we also did a little one looking at male frontal fibrosing alopecia, which is actually quite rare compared to female frontal fibrosing. And finally, one of the kind of really interesting ones we've also funded, which is a really little grant of only £500, but it's actually to look at media representation of people with alopecia up at St Andrews. And that's going to be a really interesting project, because the sort of the movement behind that one is that that's a small project which will lead the researcher truly into bigger things.
And I think sometimes some of these projects, it is funding something that can hopefully then develop into bigger things. It's almost like a starter fund sometimes to kind of, it can lead on, it helps people to get started, to get the things that they need, and then sometimes they can go and apply for much bigger grants elsewhere. You know, I think a lot of the research stuff, you know, often it's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds, isn't it, to do research? And I mean, we're just not there yet in that size.
Yeah. But what we can do, and particularly with things like Shruti, is like say, yes, we can give you the money, and they can do what we'd call a pilot study. So you quite often do the research, the initial bit of research with either a smaller number of samples, fewer people, maybe less questions if you're doing something psychology based, so that you can do an initial kind of assessment and say, what is this telling us? What are the sort of basic trends from this? Because it might not give you an answer that's kind of that you can use properly, but it'll give you an idea of maybe what the right questions are to ask, and then you can go and apply for more funding and say, look, this is our initial data, these are the results we got from this study, and that takes you further. And it helps other people as well, because maybe you might ask a question which is like, does this work, and you get a very quick no answer, and that's actually also really helpful.
Yeah. So we at the moment we've got we've got our research pots, which is kind of £10,000 grants, isn't it? And then this year we added smaller grants, didn't we? I think 1,500 and 500, and
yeah.
So different levels to suit the different things, and all of it is to hopefully support a lot more researchers to kind of get going. And so yeah, we just need to grab the interest of a few more researchers, don't we, in different areas of research as well, I guess, to get them looking at it.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's really nice, because we are starting to grow a bigger network of researchers that we know, and you know, who work with us or who have funding from us. And the more people that we talk to, the more people we get to know, and the more people know that we actually do fund research, then the more our voice will be heard out there.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, thank you, Carolyn. It's been really interesting. I'm sorry to have quizzed you so much.
It's actually been really fun, so thank you.
But I think, so to finish, it would just be to say that so this is we just wanted to have a bit of a chat about research, and to let you all know what's happening and how we're supporting research at Alopecia UK, but a little bit of a flavour of what is happening out there in the research world as well. If you want to go and read about all of the different things that we've funded, everything's on our website. And because we've had Carolyn doing all this fantastic sort of stuff, we've got loads of brilliant blog posts on there as well, where you can read about you know, updates from different researchers and what they're up to and what they're doing. But other than that, I think we can probably finish there, Carolyn.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you for having me.
No, and thank you, and hopefully everyone is getting involved in the 15 for 15 birthday bonanza campaign. I've said it all wrong there. But I hope everyone's enjoying the videos so far, and I hope that this has been useful for those of you watching. And questions, you can post them below. We'll answer them if we can, but otherwise we might look at what videos to do in future as well.
Yeah, that's always really good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye.